The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
There's a great article by Eric Sasson in the New Republic, which points out something that I've been talking about with you guys since November 8th, but especially since January 20th. And what I've been telling you is that it's great that there's mobilization and activation of more voters and new people as a result of the disaster that is the Donald Trump administration. The entire resist thing is important, it's great, it's valuable, and progressives need to resist Trump's absurdity at every opportunity that there is. But progressives, and especially from a sort of electoral perspective, House and Senate Democrats need to do more than just resist. They actually need a progressive platform to push and resist with. And Sasson points this out astutely in his article, where he says, quote, "Progressives have fallen into a familiar pattern early in Donald Trump's presidency. Wait for him to screw up, and then, depending on the severity of the offense, react with mockery or outrage. This applies to the trivial, as when Trump tweeted despite the negative press copfefe, and to the consequential, as when he withdrew the United States last week from the Paris Climate Agreement. Trump's disaster after disaster, embarrassment after embarrassment, scandal after scandal, it's created an environment for serious criticism from the left. But progressives and Democrats do need a plan to unify people around voting for something in 2018 and in 2020, not just against Trump. We know that just doing the we're against the incumbent thing isn't hugely effective. Look at George W. Bush's reelection in 2004. George W. Bush's approval rating in the last month or so before the 2004 election was as low as 47%. And he won. And yes, maybe it was partially because of strange electoral stuff in Ohio, where he ended up winning by 118,000 votes. But still, it came down to just Ohio, and he did win there by that margin or close to it, if you believe that there was foul play there. So Democrats need a progressive message and a few issues to make their issues. And rallying and holding signs is great, and it's fine if it gets people involved. But it's not going to win elections, right? That's from the voters' point of view. And opposing Trump when he does crazy things is all well and good for House and Senate Democrats, but you need specific issues that will get people active. And I hope that Democrats will take this seriously, Pat.
Yeah, I think the issue with going too anti-Trump is that what if the Trump-Russia investigations come back negative and there's no proof of collusion?
Sure.
What if his approval ratings stay north of 40% and the stock market continues to do well and the economy continues to do relatively well? You have to be able to have something that you can go on the offensive with.
Not only that, if the Trump-Russia thing implodes and Trump is actually impeached, now you don't even have Trump to run against in 2018 or 2020. So I believe the issues for progressives, and ideally Democrats should be, there's overlap in progressives and Democrats, but it's not 100%, as I'm sure you know. Healthcare, single most important issue to Americans, according to the most recent Gallup most important problem poll. Healthcare for all should be the message. Now, careful. When I say that, I don't necessarily mean single-payer government-run healthcare. That's what I would love. That's maybe too specific and a non-starter politically at this point. But healthcare for all, as in something for everyone, some basic level of care for everybody, 100% coverage that is affordable and that actually covers you. Okay. Number two, save the planet. Get away from global warming specifically and even go beyond climate change. Craft a message on the environment that is not as much science versus non-science, although that's accurate, right? But we know that it doesn't really convince people. Couch it as patriotic and a moral duty and an economic duty, right? When it comes to the jobs of the future, make it an economic reality when we talk about the environment. Combined with that, second most, you can combine both environment and jobs, because jobs is the second most important problem, according to the Gallup most important problem poll. So I think those are should be the top two calling card issues for all progressives and Democrats to unite on.
You really do have to hone in on a few issues that will poll well among the American public, and that might mean putting things like gun control and the death penalty on the back burner.
Bill Scher talked to us about that. He said, you know, strategically, it might make sense for Democrats not to really be talking about gun control as much and to pick a third issue. There's a sort of amalgam of a few issues that are important to people based on that Gallup poll: immigration, race relations, national security, and international issues all together. There needs to be a sort of united front on these issues from the left. It's more complex, but it can't be the brand of identity politics that I've criticized that doesn't work. It can't ignore the obvious problem of the impact of radical Islamic terror in the West, sort of in the model of Saudi Wahhabism and ISIS. Immigration, it can't be a xenophobic version of, quote, fixing immigration. It needs to make sense. This is sort of a topic in and of itself, but progressives need a unified plan there. And that's going to be difficult, I think, because of some of the fracturing on the left on that issue.
And I think we've already learned this lesson through Hillary Clinton, because in the last few months of her campaign, she focused a lot more on Trump's temperament, on his readiness to lead, on how he treats women. And, you know, those sound like winning points, but if you're not going on the offensive, if you don't have an overwhelmingly populist economic message, you're not going to win those Rust Belt states.
And to not be overly critical of progressives and Democrats, as Pat sort of builds the critique there, the paradigm of American politics is and has been contrarianism, right? Go against those in power if you're out of power. There needs to be a change. You lost to Donald Trump, and yes, preventing the DNC from messing with the primary ever again the way it did in 2016 is also important. That's a whole other conversation. Maybe round it out with ending the war on drugs and maybe a $15 minimum wage. This week is what Donald Trump is calling Infrastructure Week. It's sort of an attempt to distract Americans from the worsening Russia scandal and the endless attempts to do anything within his administration. Bigger picture, though, I've been telling you for a while that Donald Trump's version of infrastructure plans are really just privatization and crony capitalist handout plans. And that's exactly what we're seeing in his latest proposal, which is the privatization of air traffic control. Take a look at this. Yesterday, making a big deal out of shaking hands and signing a deal to privatize air traffic control at airports around the world. This is sort of a conservative dream. Almost no other country in the world has a fully private air traffic control system. The White House official who has been pushing for this move is Trump's chief economic advisor, Gary Cohn, former president and CEO of none other than Goldman Sachs. Drain the swamp, right? Our air traffic control system has the crucially important task of controlling American airspace. Currently, it's operated by the Federal Aviation Administration. There has not been a fatal crash of a domestic passenger airliner in 8 years. Statistically, flying in the U.S. is safer than it has ever been. And to give you a sense of how safe American commercial aviation is, not a single person even died on an airplane crash in a U.S. certified scheduled airline operating anywhere in the world. And part of that is because of air traffic control in 2016. We're talking about 300 airport towers and flight tracking centers, 35,000 workers, 14,000 controllers, 6,000 technicians. Major operation, right? Trump wants to hand it all over to a private corporation, which, don't worry, it'll be a nonprofit corporation, Pat.
At least with the privatization of ATC, you're not siphoning off public funds to go to it. So, for example, when we talk about charter schools or private prisons, taxpayers are still paying for those. With the ATC, it'll just be reflected in airline tickets.
Yes and no. Yes, you'll pay more for it in airline tickets. There's no doubt about it. But you would still be transferring all of those assets to the private sector. And who paid for those assets originally? It was taxpayers. That is a gift to these companies. So yes, you're right. On an operational ongoing basis, you stop using taxpayer money. But we're talking about endless billions of dollars in infrastructure. Here you go. Here, have it, private corporation. Take it.
Yeah, it still is not a good thing. One of those things that you would want to be a public good.
Yeah.
And not one that you would think a profit incentive would make sense for.
And the way that Pat points out, the proposal from Trump would be that this private air traffic control would be funded by individual airlines, and the corporation's board member positions would be held by representatives of those airlines. Let's think about that for a second. It makes it certain that this ATC corporation would be dominated by a small group of the largest and most politically influential companies and groups. You're basically turning the ATC into a corporate board for big airlines who, by the way, have been lobbying for this to happen since the 1980s. Why? Because it would give them the power to prioritize their companies when it comes to controlling air traffic. Now, the AOPA, which is the Aircraft Owners and Pilots Association, largest aviation association in the world, they're staunchly against this for many reasons, one of which is that it will be the death of non-commercial aviation. If you privatize ATC, it would result in pilots paying usage fees per flight, which is usually sort of an integral part of these private ATC systems elsewhere in the world. This is like if the roads were owned by one company, and every time you got in your car and wanted to drive on a road, you had to pay them because they control the traffic lights and street signs. In a way, it's sort of like toll roads.
Yeah.
But if the toll roads were owned or managed not by a state, but rather by a private corporation. This is the biggest ruse. And by the way, the entire delay thing that we hear about, I recently talked about United Airlines saying we've got to modernize ATC and maybe privatize ATC because ATC is responsible for delays. And the Trump administration said the same thing. If we privatize, we're going to drastically reduce flight delays. Total and utter nonsense. There are basically two causes for delays: weather, which we can't change, and airlines, the very people who would be running this private version of air traffic control. It is such a ruse, Pat, but you hear about Trumpists who love this. They say, yeah,
Really?
Of course we want to privatize. Yeah, we want to privatize because private industry does everything better than the government.
But I think most Trump supporters, when they went to the polls to cast their ballot, they were not voting on this issue.
Well, no, it's not a voting issue. It's not a voting issue, but it's one that many Trumpists will see as a sort of accomplishment of sorts for Donald Trump. He privatized something. Privatization is not necessary. It's not necessary to modernize ATC, which is also something we hear about. They've got old radar systems. We need new radar systems, so we'll privatize. Hold on a second. The process of going from public to private is going to take years. During that time, there will be no modernization of ATC. If and when the transition is completed from public to private, then you can start talking about modernization, something that the FAA is already working on. So you're actually just going to further delay that. It's absolutely bogus. There is going to be a lack of oversight here. Does anyone who has flown recently think that airlines are efficient and competent enough to run all of air traffic control when all non-weather related delays depend on them, when they constantly are deferring maintenance on airplanes to the absolute maximum, and in the case of United, in one case that we recently learned about, beyond the maximum for safety? I don't want this going private. Donald Trump does. And I guess, Pat, we can hope that the free market works things out, right? You might have a few airplane crashes, but then it'll really incentivize these companies to get their stuff together with the private ATC.
Yeah, and if you remember with that United incident, they tried to blame air traffic control for what happened there. It's going to be a lot harder to do if this is taken over by private industry.
Yeah, when you control air traffic control, all of a sudden it's harder to blame air traffic control as this disconnected entity from the government that's causing all of your problems. Disaster. I'm on Twitter at dpacman. Send me your thoughts about the privatization of ATC.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Today's new member of the day is Robert Groves. Robert, thank you for being a David Pakman Show member. We're mostly funded by members like Robert, and you can sign up at davidpakman.com/membership. Of course, Patreon also available, patreon.com/David Pakman Show, and davidpakman.com/Amazon. Anytime you shop on Amazon, stop by there. It'll send us a little kickback for everything you buy. Remember when we talked about Donald Trump's embarrassing speech at the NATO summit in Brussels, Belgium a couple of weeks ago? Trump made these totally arbitrary claims about NATO states not paying their fair share in terms of their contributions to NATO, demanding that other countries expand their military budgets. He refused to affirm Article 5 of the NATO Charter, which says that an attack on one NATO country is considered an attack on all NATO countries. And we already knew that NATO members were sort of baffled by this, but we've now learned that Donald Trump also bewildered and surprised our own national security officials when he made those comments in Brussels. 5 sources with direct knowledge of what happened said that National Security Advisor H.R. McMaster and Defense Secretary Jim Mattis, as well as Secretary of State Rex Tillerson, all wanted and were expecting Donald Trump to show up and show support for Article 5 in his speech, and they were blindsided by what Donald Trump actually said. They worked with Trump to prepare him in support to support NATO in that speech. They expected him to support Article 5 in that speech. And a day before the speech, a White House aide even told the New York Times, oh yeah, Trump's going to support Article 5 in the speech. Somehow, by the time of the speech, Trump instead ended up showing disdain for the institution of NATO. And according to sources involved in the reporting of the story, Trump made the last-minute change without consulting or even telling any of his advisors. One of the sources said, quote, they didn't know it had been removed. It was only upon delivery. Apparently, Mattis, McMaster, and Tillerson, who I refer to as the adults in the room, they were trying to get a copy of the speech right beforehand. They got it, and they saw the Article 5 thing is gone from the speech. And then it was too late. Donald Trump had changed his mind. And as you know, it seems that whatever someone says to Donald Trump 5 minutes before the speech is sort of what sticks and what he ends up saying. This is a national security issue. And I know that Cobb Fefe is funnier and it makes more headlines. You're talking about a president that is not in sync with the people at the top in terms of ensuring the security of our country. They're bewildered and blindsided by what the president is saying on the national stage.
I think it would help if he paid attention to those daily press briefings, too, for national security. But, you know, Republicans loved his speech to NATO because it showed independence and that he was kind of giving the middle finger to Europe.
Yep.
I guess this is independent as well. He's not even listening to his own national security team.
That's the problem with this, because rational people like everybody in our audience that isn't you know, on the opposite side, and you, Pat, and me, we see this as erratic and haphazard and dangerous. That's not how a lot of Trumpists are going to see it. They're going to see this and think, great, this shows that Donald Trump is independent. He thinks for himself. He tells it like it is. He won't be influenced by so-called experts. Really, this just shows the level of dysfunction in the administration. And even if Donald Trump wanted to do this and wanted to defy the advice of his advisors who are more qualified than him, the least he can do is at least inform them that he's going to do this. Tell them, hey, we're going to disagree on this, instead of switching things around on the fly, which is, there's no upside to doing that.
And let me know if I'm getting too conspiratorial here, but obviously the speech to NATO played well into Russia's hand because they know that the United States wouldn't necessarily act if one of the NATO members was attacked.
Right.
So is it perhaps possible that because H.R. McMaster and General Mattis aren't really involved in the Russia scandal, there's really no direct connections to them at this point?
Well,
that's why he'd want to keep them out of the loop?
Without getting proactively conspiratorial.
Yes.
There's no doubt that Trump would be much more in line with disgraced former National Security Advisor Michael Flynn in terms of his stance on NATO.
See, I think Michael Flynn would have known.
I think you're absolutely right. Flynn would have proposed that this is what Trump says. And it's yet another way in which Russia is going to sort of like what Donald Trump is doing, which we've been talking about as well. I don't think it's too conspiratorial to go in that direction. Yeah. Bad news for Donald Trump. There are now more people in the United States who want Donald Trump impeached than the number that approve of the job he is doing. This is not good for Donald Trump. We've been tracking Trump's approval rating, and it's back down near its presidency lows. The Gallup daily tracking poll bottomed out at 35% on March 28th. It sort of popped back up a bit into the low 40s, back down to 36% yesterday, 37% today. So there's a 3% margin of error. Basically, Trump's approval rating is equal to as low as it's been for his entire presidency thus far. Compare that, the 37% approval rating, to the latest Politico Morning Consult poll, which shows that 43% of Americans now support starting impeachment proceedings against Donald Trump. Does this matter? Well, it does in a couple of senses. One is what we can expect from Trump this week, especially considering the upcoming testimony of fired FBI Director James Comey on Thursday. Tweets to distract, tweets to distort, tweets to preempt. And it already started this morning. Tweets like, for example, from Donald Trump, the fake mainstream media is working so hard to get me to not use social media. They hate that I can get the honest and unfiltered message out. The funniest line from the write-ups about the approval numbers is the following, which is from a Newsweek article about this. Quote, whereas Trump enjoyed record high popularity near the end of his first trip abroad since assuming the Oval Office, nearing 42% or above in several polls or indexes, now he is once again in the historic territory of being one of the least popular new presidents in modern American history. How poorly are things going, Pat, when 42% represents your record high approval?
It's possible that some of the Trump supporters just think we're winning too much under him, and that's why they support his impeachment.
Yeah, 42% is both, it's hilarious that that's as high as he got, and it's shocking that he actually got that high as well, given that he's accomplished nothing. The reality is, as Pat's alluding to, the committed Trumpists are committed, quite literally. They will never criticize Trump or say they disapprove no matter what he does. They already believe that he is a great savior president. They believed, many of them anyway, that for the last 8 years, President Obama was the worst president in American history. Where it matters for the U.S. today is not that low information Trumpists think Trump is a hero. It matters that the world opinion of the U.S., goodwill and willingness to work with us, was higher under President Obama than it had been for a long time. Recall the opinion of the world about us under George W. Bush, disaster. And Donald Trump has single-handedly destroyed most of that goodwill in just 4 months. That's actually a major accomplishment of the Trump administration in terms of its scope. It's a disaster, but it's actually an amazing accomplishment how quickly Donald Trump has destroyed the image of the United States around the world in such a short period of time. Let's talk about the travel ban real quick. After the terrorist attacks in London, Donald Trump wasted no time using it as an opportunity to pat himself on the back, just like he did after the Orlando shooting some time ago. Donald Trump tweeting, "We need to be smart, vigilant, and tough. We need the courts to give us back our rights. We need the travel ban as an extra level of safety." He sent another tweet about the travel ban saying, quote, "Whatever the United States can do to help out in London and the UK, we will be there. We are with you. God bless." But the travel ban, that's the first priority. So after the attack, all of a sudden, the number one thing is we need the travel ban. Trump was right all along, blah, blah, blah. The problem is it supposedly wasn't a travel ban. Donald Trump may have shot himself in the foot here. He says we need the travel ban, yet his administration has denied for a long time that it is a travel ban. One other tweet, I believe, that we have that Donald Trump sent about the travel ban. So this is the first one that which we showed travel ban we need as an extra level of safety. And then we have one other tweet, I believe, about the travel ban. That's right. We need a travel ban for certain dangerous countries, not some politically correct term that won't help us protect our people. Trump himself previously denied that it was a travel ban. White House lawyers have just asked the Supreme Court to hear the case. It has been ruled by lower courts to be unconstitutional because it discriminates based on religion. And for White House lawyers, a big part of defending this was saying it's not actually a ban. This is a disaster for Trump, isn't it?
Yeah, it's the latest instance of his tweeting being the cause of him to shoot himself in the foot on this one. I mean, It's a completely unforced error. And, his own team has to get behind him and have these interventions to try to get him off of Twitter.
Right.
And, internet addiction is a real thing, but you don't typically associate it among 70-year-old billionaires.
Who happen to be presidents of the United States. The ACLU tweeted about this, responding to Donald Trump's tweet, saying, "Glad we both agree the ban is a ban." So this is really sort of like the main issue around admitting that it's a travel ban. What's in the ban itself is not all that matters. The previous rulings on Trump's travel bans have said the context in which the legislation is created matters. And as a result, we can consider what Donald Trump said during rallies about his intent when it comes to this travel ban. We can look at what Donald Trump has said in different venues. There's no doubt courts have made it clear, Pat, that Donald Trump tweeting multiple times that really the goal of this is to be a travel ban, that can be considered by courts when determining the true goal of this ban.
It's really no wonder, too, why he's lost and had to settle so many cases.
Yeah.
You remember the Trump University lawsuit? He attacked the judge for being a Mexican-American.
Of course.
The guy was from Indiana, but he couldn't help himself.
just can't control himself. He genuinely appears to not be able to control himself on Twitter, and a lot of people on our Reddit discussion forum are talking about this and other Twitter-related goofs that have taken place. Join us there, davidpakman.com/Reddit.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
We're continuing our conversation today with Peter Joseph, founder of the Zeitgeist movement, also author of the new book, The New Human Rights Movement. We started getting into, Peter, this concept of scarcity, and I want to talk about that sort of in the context of market capitalism. In many more micro ways, you point out in the book, for example, with food production and hunger, that the concept of scarcity and lack of resources to meet the needs is essentially a contrived result of how we've decided to allocate resources. And you point out in great detail in the appendix to the book how not only food production and hunger could be solved with current resources and technology, but so could clean water and energy. Let's maybe start and focus on food production and hunger. Would you call this a decision that has been made effectively by global society not to solve the problem of hunger?
Well, that would inch into kind of a conspiratorial view, which I don't subscribe to with any of this. What I think it is, it's a cultural unfolding that goes back hundreds of years to before the 18th century, late 18th century, and the start of the Industrial Revolution, what some people call the Great Divergence. Scarcity has been with society in a very visceral way since the Neolithic Revolution 12,000 years ago, when we emerged from hunter-gatherer tribes that had a fairly abundant amount of resources and a completely different type of lifestyle. And then once settled agrarian society happened, it set a kind of geographical determinism, so to speak, something other theorists call cultural anthropology, if anyone wants to look that up. It's very fascinating. And it set the framework for what we see as the market economy today. You have property, you have capital, the means of production, you have labor specialization, jobs, you have the need for regulation, government protection, law, and so many other attributes like that, which codify the system we have at the moment. And within that is the fundamental foundation of the assumption of universal scarcity. And it's become a political term because of, if you believe in anything other than a scarcity worldview, then suddenly you can't justify the rampant competition that we see. Suddenly you can't justify 8 people having more wealth, the bottom 50% of the world. Suddenly you can't justify all of this imbalance. And that's why scarcity has to be reevaluated in a very, very serious way. And going to the food part, we throw away half of our food right now on this planet, roughly, almost. Half of the food produced on this planet, with all the energy and hydrocarbons, gets trashed because of inefficiencies in the pipeline and a general belligerence of Western culture at the same time, and our gratuitous materialism, our lack of consideration of what's really happening in the world. That's an unfortunate phenomenon culturally in Western societies. We're blocked off. Anyway, so you have that already, that we have the potential to feed the entire world. We produce enough calories to feed the world more or less 2 times over. And then you have the applied technology that isn't being utilized, systems-based technology, the incredible efficiency possibilities of vertical farm systems, of engineered permaculture, of all sorts of advanced means that would, for example, if you localized food production, say I'm in Los Angeles, and we could localize all of our produce if we wanted to, eliminating the fact that the average American meal travels about 1,500 miles before it goes to your plate. Think about that. Because of this horrid work of globalization, which is about exploiting, labor in far distant lands along with resources. So we can do it with what we have today, and if you applied advanced technology that we have under our belt but is not being funded or subsidized or invested into the degrees that are required, we could easily create a total food abundance on this planet. I can continue with the other.
Well, I was going to say, to stick with this example, just to sort of see it through, so people can understand sort of your thought process with something like this. What you're saying will make a lot of sense to most people who are listening to or watching this interview, and it will also seem like something that we should be taking more seriously as a society, as a human race. But what's the first step in starting to unwind the system we have? And we can do it through this issue of hunger, just because we've been talking about it. How do you start? Like, what's step one? And we talk a lot, I'm reminded of campaign finance reform. Everybody talks about campaign finance reform. We've got to fix how we finance elections. Here's 10 different ways that it could be done. Great. Our decision makers are in because of the system that got them there. Why would they change the system that got them there? We're already at a sort of impasse. So how do you start working against such an establishment incumbent system to make positive change?
Well, at the core, you need a galvanized community that wants it. Let's point that out, first of all. And without the educational work that needs to be done, such as why the book was written, to see the potentials, you can't get very far. If people still believe in general scarcity as the politicized symbology it is that justifies the unequal world that we have, then we're not going to get very far. But in terms of technicals, as I mentioned briefly in what I said prior, localization of food, coupled with advanced automation technology we already have, we could easily create local the amount of food that's required without the need for transport. I'm big on that. I think I always maintain a global consciousness in terms of recognizing the world as one systemic whole. But at the same time, there are good reasons to localize and to make things regionally specific, namely for the saving of efficiency, transport efficiency, energy efficiency, and of course, distribution efficiency. So if it was me and I was in a position of policy, what I would do is create large automated agricultural systems, specifically vertical farms. There are other potentials, but we'll just go with that one. Those have tremendous efficiency potentials because they can be built in industrial urban areas, and they use very little water, resources, and nutrients to produce very high quality produce. And you put those along the coastlines of Los Angeles, wherever you are, you can put them anywhere ultimately and irrigate to them. And then you basically do not import anything anymore. You make it a basic localized mandate to create local food. And if you do that, you're going to solve the poverty problem by extension. Then eventually you make it free. Once the automated systems are in place, you, quote, socialize it. I use that almost tongue in cheek. But in the most traditional sense today, the use of the term socialization means to make publicly available without the need for exchange. And if you had a system doing that with minor subsidization, along with the technical efficiency that would maximize the efficiency output, along with reducing the amount of labor required, you could do it. And you would end poverty region by region through that approach.
Whether we're talking about the poverty or hunger example, or more broadly, because you talk about so much in the book, I mean, our criminal justice system, incarceration is another area that you write about significantly. Are most people sort of thinking too micro even about solutions? I mean, for example, universal basic income. This is something that, economist Richard Wolff, for example, talks about as it's something that would make sense within the current system, but it's not going to change the system we have to one that makes more sense. How do you balance micro approaches to fixing symptoms of our current system versus activism towards changing the system more broadly?
Balance is an interesting word. I'd say it's more of a progressive pattern that pushes towards larger system changes through more micro steps. So universal basic income is a step towards the acknowledgement at a minimum that the system we have is inefficient in its distribution. I mean, that's something that needs to be just blatantly plastered everywhere. The reason we have inequality is because the system is simply inefficient. And it stands in the face of all those people that say, well, markets are the most efficient system we've ever had. Actually, you couldn't possibly come up with a more wasteful and inefficient system than what we have today. So universal basic income coupled with creating industries that become, quote, socialized once again through advanced technological means are two steps that can lead us to transforming this society in an incremental way. Now, I want to point out, since you brought up universal basic income, because I know a lot of people that are big into this, and it's been on my mind, there's one big flaw with universal basic income in this kind of in-system solution, and that comes down to what's been termed by other historians as sort of capitalist contradictions. What's happened since the 1970s specifically is the credit expansion in the West has been outrageous. It's because there's so much debt produced in the system that people can't keep up. Wages have stagnated. So in order to keep money moving in this kind of cyclical consumption economy that we have, you have to give people money. And what has been done with that is through credit expansion. 43% of the average, 43% of the American population spends more than they actually take in every single year. And it's not just because they're flagrantly living beyond their means. They have to keep up. They keep up with a system that's effectively moving against them, something in the book I call structural classism or structural bigotry, in effect. So my point being is that when you provide people with universal basic income, what you're really doing is satisfying a built-in inefficiency of capitalism, which will actually placate the capitalist system if you don't have a larger view. And I hope people understand what I mean by that. Because you're giving people money that they can spend back into the system, which ultimately, through the magic of structural classism, will trickle right back up to the upper 1% anyway.
Well, that's the sort of inherent impossibility of the system we have. I mean, when you look at credit, you would only loan someone money if you believe that in the future things are going to be better for them such that they could pay that back with interest, so on and so forth. If you have a planet of limited resources and size and some, at least at this point, hypothetical maximum population carrying capacity, at some point that system is going to fail you, isn't it?
Well, absolutely. I mean, if you're speaking about credit as a general phenomenon, keep in mind we produce more interest in this system than money. So the debt plus the interest that's created exceeds the money supply of our entire planet, which is basically a recipe for bankruptcies and failures and more oppression of the lower class. There's about $200 trillion right now in outstanding outstanding debt on this planet, 200 trillion, and there's only about 81 trillion in actual currency, in actual money. So that disparity effectively translates into more repossessed houses, more empowerment of the financial services sector and the banking system, because they're the ones that take that physical property, hence the 1% and the elitism that we see today, and so on and so forth. So no, it's not sustainable. It's only sustainable from the standpoint of the acceptance of social failure, acceptance of social inequality, acceptance of social oppression and suffering. And sadly enough, people today have been so indoctrinated into that reality, they can't see beyond it. You know what I mean?
No doubt about it. And now thinking ahead, I mean, it's such a 30,000 foot problem that I think it's difficult for a lot of people to even conceive of that. Well, 200 trillion in debt, 80 trillion in money. What eventually happens?
Well, you have the boom and bust cycle, as it's called, which is really driven less by tangible innovation and so on, as is pitched in traditional economic workbooks, and more by just the influx and outflux of money. So you have periods of monetary expansion, whether it's basic, interest rates being being lowered, that creates monetary expansion, or when there's crises, they do QE and so on. So you have that period of expansion that creates more money into circulation. It goes into the production of goods, into the hiring of people and labor, and you build effectively more debt because all money is created out of debt. I hope you're aware of that. That's one of the central problems underlying the market system. So all money is created out of debt with interest charged upon it, and you produce two phenomena. You produce too much debt, you get debt saturation, whether it's domestically or internationally, and then you get inflation. So when debt and inflation become too high in the boom-bust cycle, that's when they contract interest rates, and that's when you start to see the real structural classism kick in, and that's where the failure happens. And again, we accept this failure as though that's just the way it is, as you know. Yeah. It's really stunning because the amount of suffering that happens on that downturn is truly staggering. During the 2008 Great Recession, there were 500,000 deaths during that block of time due to a lack of medical treatment correlated to the Great Recession for people that had cancer. There are also about 46,000 suicides across the United States and about 63 other nations that correlated to it as well. So this is a caustic, deadly phenomenon, and people don't perceive that structural violence because they're detached from it. You know what I mean? Everyone thinks of violence as you put a gun to somebody's head. There's a whole painful level of violence that happens from a structural imposition. Something Johan Gallup called, as I said, structural violence, and he's another individual of the Gandhi Institute I think people should look into. And if people really realize the violence that is happening through things like the boom and bust cycle, through this debt system, through just the inequality gaming patterns that happen with capitalism, and the fact that if you have enough money and wealth, you will continue to get more money and wealth and power. So the social mobility has always been in question. It's much worse today than it ever was, and so on. And I think if I often say I fear for the day. I both fear and long for the day, David, where the general population realizes the violence that's happening against them. Because once they perceive that, it's not going to be pretty.
The book is The New Human Rights Movement. We've been speaking with the book's author, Peter Joseph, also founder of the Zeitgeist movement. Peter, thanks so much for being on. I've been looking forward to this.
Absolutely, Dave. I really appreciate your time. And thank you for the great show. I always enjoy listening to you.
Thank you.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
A Donald Trump press release sent out a few days ago cited conspiracy website InfoWars as a source. You might be aware about InfoWars being an Alex Jones-run, far right-wing conspiracy theorist website and YouTube channel. If you're not familiar with InfoWars, to give you sort of an idea of the kinds of stories that they report, here are some actual headlines from the InfoWars website that I will show you. For example, 9/11, CIA likely built remote-controlled commercial jets in aircraft boneyard. Another example, overwhelming evidence mounts indicating Colorado shooting was staged. Another example, government caught in Boston bombing, false flag cover-up. Norway terror attacks, a false flag. San Bernardino, false flag. Brussels attacks are false flags. New World Order, opening thousands of portals to ancient demons. Bruno Mars Illuminati halftime show decoded. And the classic that many of you may have heard of, the government and big pharma are turning frogs gay. InfoWars genuinely appears to be one of Donald Trump's favorite media outlets. Here's Donald Trump praising InfoWars during the 2016 election.
I just want to finish by saying your reputation's amazing. I will not let you down. You will be very, very impressed, I hope. And I think we'll be speaking a lot.
Donald Trump also tweeting an InfoWars article that, quote, proves that Trump's claim about Muslims celebrating on 9/11 was true. I live in New Jersey, and real Donald Trump is right. Muslims did celebrate on 9/11. Here, we saw it. InfoWars has been one of the most vocal outlets pushing the narrative about the non-existent 3 to 5 million illegal voters for Hillary Clinton. They had an article not long ago saying, report 3 million votes in presidential election cast by illegal aliens. And a week and a half ago, the Trump administration issued a one-day press pass to InfoWars. And now this is sort of the cherry on top. The Trump administration citing InfoWars in press releases. Apparently, Trump got so insecure again about the size of his crowds that he sent a message to his campaign supporter email list talking about how Trump supporters outnumber protesters. And at the bottom of the message, they link to an InfoWars article. Is this because Trump wasn't able to find another outlet with a headline this flattering to his administration? What does it tell you that Donald Trump has to resort to lunatic propaganda fringe websites to find somebody that agrees with much of what he believes?
Well, he clearly can't rely on his own White House to report the crowd sizes in Washington, D.C. anymore, because when they tried to do it with just the metro numbers, it didn't go so well.
He didn't like those numbers. And here's the picture, by the way, at the top of the article that Donald Trump linked to. The article refers to the Paris Agreement as a globalist plot, naturally. Yeah. So anyway, this is new, right? I mean, this is actually, I know we shouldn't pay more attention to InfoWars than they are worthy of, but Fox News is nothing compared to InfoWars. This is basically bottom of the barrel propaganda website.
I mean, there's certainly plenty of crossover when it comes to people who tune into InfoWars and Trump supporters.
I'll say.
So he has to give them some sort of dog whistle and some sort of approval.
Yeah, when a Trumpist maybe casually knows about InfoWars, and then, hey, I mean, after all, it's a Trump press release that is citing InfoWars. They must be some kind of legitimate news source. The fact that they were given that one-day pass, which, you know, high school newspaper reporters can get to attend a press briefing, also doesn't help, even if it was conspiracy theorist Jerome Corsi who was allowed in for the day. So this is the era that we're living in. Let me tell you about the results to our davidpakman.com poll asking, how will Donald Trump's accomplishments in his second 100 days compared to his first 100 days. Now, normal caveats here before I start getting angry right-wing emails. I am not representing these results as scientific polling results. This is merely representative of the portion of our audience that chose to go to davidpakman.com and vote in this poll, okay? Let's take a look at the results. How will Donald Trump's accomplishments in his second 100 days compare to the first 100 days? 42% of our audience believes that Donald Trump will get way less done in his second 100 days compared to his first 100. 17% believe that Trump will get somewhat less done. So in total, nearly 60% of our audience believes that the second 100 days of Trump will see less accomplished than the first 100 days. That alone says a lot because very little was accomplished in the first 100 days. 31% of our audience believes that Trump will get the same amount done in the second 100 days as he did in the first. Now, if you believe he got nothing done in the first 100 days and you believe he will get the same done in the second 100 days, it still doesn't bode well. Only 10% of our audience believes that Donald Trump will get any more done during his second 100 days than the first. I tend to agree with our audience that we are not going to see accomplishments. That being said, I predict that we will see way more damage done by Trump in the second 100 days.
It's also tough to say whether or not that he accomplished a lot in the first 100 days because just so much of what he did was struck down.
Yeah.
Like his Muslim travel ban was struck down, like the Affordable Care Act replacement didn't go through Congress.
That's a fair point, which is if Donald Trump does his part, but then because of the law, the Constitution, rational people in the House and Senate, it doesn't end up being made into law. Is it still an accomplishment for Trump? And if he did his part, I would argue no. You are the president. Yeah. The buck stops with you. If you're making promises, you're already making them in the context of the fact that there are checks and balances. And I think if you don't get them done, you didn't get it done.
I think I'm undecided on this poll, but if you look at history, I mean, the first 100 days is important because that's when the president has the most pull on Congress.
Yeah.
And that's going to fade away.
Normally, except Trump came in with already low approval ratings. So you're probably right that it's the best window for Trump to get things done. And yet he had a, quote, record high approval for his presidency of 42%. Just pathetic. Our next poll at davidpakman.com is, do you believe that Donald Trump is untouchable no matter what he does? Vote now at davidpakman.com. Nearly 500 of you already have, and we will have those results for you next week. We've got a voicemail number. It is 219-2-DAVID-P. I believe we're hearing from the Eggman today, right? Let's take a listen to what the Eggman had to say here.
Hi, Dave. The Bill Maher joke was funny. You just didn't get it. It wasn't about race. It was about class. A house N-word does not work the fields. They work inside with the master doing all the cushy work. That's all Bill Maher was saying. And I think a guy that has lived his whole life fighting for the rights of African Americans can drop the N-word in a joke sometimes. And it was funny. Everything you said was correct about it, except that it wasn't funny. Just because you didn't get it doesn't mean it wasn't funny, Dave. That's all. Shalom.
Yeah. Well, my sense of humor aside, the Eggman seems to believe that something was funny. And you know what I've learned, Pat, about whether someone thinks things are funny or doesn't think they're funny? It's hard to agree about whether things are funny because it's subjective. And I think on that note, I hate using this term, but we're going to have to agree to disagree.
No, don't do it.
With the Eggman
Don't
here.
do it.
Okay, yeah, I don't think it was funny. I understood the joke. I just don't think it was funny. On the bonus show today, Harvard withdraws 10 acceptances after offensive memes in online chat. The outcry over EpiPen prices has not lowered prices at all. And more bad news for United Airlines. A United Airlines supervisor reportedly tried to wrestle away a violinist from an orchestral violinist trying to get to a performance in St. Louis, Missouri. It's not looking good lately for United Airlines. All of those stories and more on the bonus show. Sign up and get instant access at davidpakman.com/membership.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.